In 2004, archaeologists working on the island of Cyprus uncovered a Neolithic grave that had remained undisturbed for roughly 9.5 millennia. Within this ancient burial site rested the remains of a man, approximately 30 years of age, interred alongside offerings of polished stone tools and ground ochre. While the grave's arrangement was consistent with the burial customs of the era, the most striking discovery lay at the man's feet: the complete skeleton of an 8-month-old cat, carefully placed in its own designated pit. This burial, dating back to about 7,500 BC, predates the rise of Egyptian civilization by over 4,000 years. The individual who shared his final resting place with this feline lived in an era devoid of writing, metal tools, or urban settlements, existing at the very dawn of agriculture. Yet, someone in that prehistoric world felt a deep enough connection to this small animal to ensure they were buried together for eternity. For decades, the standard textbook explanation for how cats became domesticated was as tidy as it was persistent. The story began in Egypt. It was widely accepted that the civilization along the Nile was the sole architect of the house cat, having tamed them roughly 4,000 years ago to worship them as deities, mummify them in vast temples, and eventually export them to the rest of the globe. This narrative was reinforced by countless documentaries, museum displays, and historical accounts. However, that Neolithic grave on Cyprus acted as a major crack in this historical facade. As modern genetics began to catch up with archaeology, it became clear that the true origin of our feline companions is far more complex and mysterious than any ancient myth could explain. Throughout most of the 20th century, researchers felt little need to question the Egypt hypothesis. The sheer volume of physical evidence, tomb paintings, bronze statues, and millions of ritual cat mummies seemed to settle the matter conclusively. Since the most prominent and earliest unambiguous Egyptian depictions of domestic cats appeared around 1950 BC, it seemed obvious that this was the starting point for their history. From there, it was assumed, Phoenician and Roman trade routes carried them into the wider world. The error in this logic, however, was substantial. Scientists were mistaking the height of human cat popularity in Egypt for the very beginning of the relationship, essentially confusing the middle of the story for its opening scene. The first real scientific blow to the Egyptian theory came in 2007, when a team led by Carlos Driscoll of the National Cancer Institute sequenced the mitochondrial DNA of nearly 1,000 cats, both wild and domestic. They were on a quest to identify the specific wild ancestor of every cat alive today, from the tuxedo cat on your sofa to the Siamese. Their findings were unexpected. The ancestor was not the Egyptian wildcat, but rather Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat, which roamed a massive territory stretching from North Africa to the Middle East and Central Asia. The genetic data shifted the focus away from the Nile and toward the Levant, the region comprising modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. This was the same region where humanity first mastered wheat, goats, and cattle, and it served as the original cradle where humans and cats first crossed paths, long before any pharaoh ever reigned. The 2007 study was a breakthrough, but it faced a recurring limitation. It relied entirely on modern DNA. This mirrored the same hurdle that had stalled canine research for years. To truly uncover the ancient past, scientists needed to analyze the genetic material of cats that had lived thousands of years ago. A decade of intense labor later, this gap was finally bridged. In 2017, the most comprehensive study of ancient cat DNA ever undertaken was published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution. A team led by Claudio Ottoni from the University of Leuven, Belgium, collaborated with institutions across Europe and the Middle East to sequence the mitochondrial DNA of 209 ancient cats. These specimens were pulled from an incredible variety of archaeological contexts, ranging from Bulgarian burial mounds and Persian palaces to Roman shipwrecks and Viking-era settlements in northern Germany. The results obtained by the Ottoni team effectively rewrote the entire history of the feline-human relationship. Their most startling revelation was that the process of domestication did not occur just once, but twice. The first wave was triggered in the Levant approximately 9,500 years ago, coinciding exactly with the dawn of the agricultural revolution. As the earliest farmers began to produce and store significant surpluses of wheat, barley, peas, and lentils, they unintentionally created a magnet for rodents. These pest populations in turn attracted wild cats. Those cats that were slightly more tolerant of human proximity, those who didn't bolt at the sight of a person, gained consistent access to a food source that their wilder counterparts lacked. Over generations, this biological self-selection created a unique population of cats that lived in the shadow of human villages, not as pets, but as uninvited yet highly beneficial neighbors. This form of relationship is what experts classify as commensal domestication, domestication that happens without any conscious human intent. In this scenario, the cats essentially domesticated themselves. Humans accepted their presence because the arrangement was mutually beneficial. The humans received natural pest control, and the cats secured a steady supply of prey. The Neolithic man found in the Cyprus grave was part of this inaugural wave of commensal history. Since Cyprus had no native wildcat population, these early farmers must have intentionally or accidentally carried the cats on their boats. For several millennia, this Levantine cat lineage spread slowly outward through the Mediterranean and into Europe, following the same trade and migration routes that carried grain and farming technology. By 6,000 years ago, these cats had reached Bulgaria, and by 4,000 years ago, they were established in Romania. However, it is crucial to note that these early cats were not yet the beloved companions we recognize today. They were silent, functional partners in the agricultural ecosystem, tolerated for their utility, but never celebrated or elevated in status. The legendary cats of art, worship, and mythology had not yet appeared on the stage of history. That cultural shift would only arrive with the second, much later wave of domestication. This next phase began in Egypt, but contrary to previous theories, it emerged much later than expected, roughly 3,500 years ago. The data from the Ottoni team revealed a new genetic lineage surfacing in Egyptian archaeological sites. These cats were not descendants of the original Levantine commensals. Instead, they were derived from a distinct population of local African wildcats. This group was domesticated independently in the Nile Valley by people who had absolutely no knowledge that a similar transformative process had occurred thousands of kilometers to their north. The Egyptian approach to these cats was fundamentally different from the earlier Levantine experience. They did not merely tolerate these animals, they fully integrated them into their lives. By 1500 BC, cats had been elevated to sacred status, deeply intertwined with the goddess Bastet. Initially, she was depicted as a fierce, lion-headed war deity, but over time, her image softened into a cat-headed guardian of the home, women, and fertility. Egyptian families treated these animals with incredible care, and by the late period, around 600 BC, the mass mummification of cats had evolved into a massive industry. Millions of these animals were specifically bred and ritually buried in temple complexes. This intense, direct human attention had deep genetic consequences. The Egyptian cats began to develop unique coat patterns and tameness traits that were entirely absent in their Levantine cousins. These Egyptian cats were the first to truly look and behave like modern household pets, rather than merely functioning as opportunistic pest controllers. Beginning roughly 2,500 years ago, this new lineage began an aggressive expansion. Genetic markers of these Egyptian-derived cats appeared in archaeological digs far outside the Nile Valley. They were discovered in Roman cemeteries scattered across the Mediterranean, in Iron Age burial sites throughout northern Europe, and in Viking-era settlements as distant as the Baltic Sea. They were spreading via the same corridors that carried Mediterranean trade goods, often hitching rides on merchant vessels. The data confirmed that these cats were effectively conquering the world by sailing the seas. The findings at a Viking site in northern Germany, dating between the 8th and 11th centuries AD, were particularly striking. Historical records confirm that the Norse were known to keep cats on their longships for pest control, as loyal companions, and because they held them in high regard as sacred to the goddess Freya, who, in mythology, drove a chariot pulled by two giant cats. The genetic evidence reveals that these seafaring cats were the direct descendants of the temple-dwelling cats of Egypt, having spent over a millennium traveling with Phoenician, Greek, and Roman traders before being adopted by the Norse. It is a surreal historical image, a lineage that began in the sacred temples of Bastet, eventually finding itself hunting rats in the rigging of Viking warships under the banner of the dragon-prowed longboats. By the dawn of the medieval era, this Egyptian lineage had largely merged with or effectively replaced the original Levantine substrate across most of Europe. Consequently, nearly every domestic cat alive today is a hybrid, carrying the genetic heritage of both major waves of domestication. The Levantine genes represent the older, foundational layer of the species, while the Egyptian genes provide the dominant, modern overlay. This was the true, hidden genetic history of the feline, two separate domestication events, separated by 6 millennia, that eventually collided and melded into the single, global population we see today.